The moment I pulled into my driveway after 3 weeks of secret meetings about my new role as CEO, I knew something was wrong. The sunset was painting the sky a brilliant orange, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the even brighter orange paper flapping on my garage door. My heart sank as I stepped closer. There was only one person bold enough to pull something like this. Margaret Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA. I had only met Margaret twice since moving in 6 months ago, but those 2 meetings were enough to know that she ran our neighborhood like her personal kingdom. The first time she lectured me because my grass was half an inch too tall. The second time, she sent her husband to measure the exact distance between my mailbox and the curb. Now she was coming for my motorcycle. I ripped the paper from the garage door, my hands shaking with frustration. Violation. Notice unauthorized vehicle storage. Remove motorcycle within 48 hours or face immediate towing and fines. Handwritten beneath the official text was a note in Margaret's perfect cursive. Motorcycles reduce property values and attract an undesirable element to our community. I looked at my pristine 2023 Harley-Davidson Road Glide, a machine that cost more than Margaret's entire SUV. I had spent countless weekends carefully washing and polishing it in my driveway. Neighborhood kids loved it. Old Mr. Johnson next door often brought his grandson over just to admire it. Yet here was Margaret calling it an undesirable element. Just then, Margaret power walked past my house in her designer exercise outfit, her perfectly styled blonde hair barely moving. She didn't wave. She didn't stop. She just glanced at my bike and tapped her $500 smartwatch. The message was clear. Time was ticking. I wanted to confront her. Tell her I wasn't just some random motorcycle enthusiast, that I was about to be announced as the new CEO of Harley-Davidson. The press release was scheduled for next week, but something told me to wait, to document everything. Instead of arguing, I took out my phone and started snapping pictures of my bike, the notice, and the spotless condition of my property. As I was photographing, my neighbor Tom Peterson stepped outside, Margaret's right-hand man, always backing up her ridiculous rules. He smirked, watering his lawn. "Shame about that bike," he called out, not sounding sorry at all. Then I saw it, his tow truck, parked in his driveway, freshly painted with Peterson's towing on the side. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't just about property values or community standards. Something else was going on. Inside my house, I opened my laptop and pulled up our HOA documents. 3 hours and 2 cups of coffee later, I still couldn't find any bylaw banning motorcycles. But I did find something interesting. Every vehicle towed in the past year had been done by Peterson's Towing, and the fees suspiciously high. My phone buzzed. Another HOA email. Emergency board meeting, tomorrow subject, vehicle policy updates. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Through my window, I saw Margaret and Tom talking in her driveway, both glancing toward my garage. I closed my laptop and smiled. I barely got 4 hours of sleep that night, knowing something wasn't right. At 3:47 a.m., my security camera alert buzzed on my phone. I groggily reached for it, expecting maybe a raccoon had set it off. But when I looked at the screen, my heart stopped. A blue tow truck had just backed into my driveway. Peterson's Towing. Tom Peterson's truck. I bolted upright, throwing on the nearest clothes I could find. By the time I raced downstairs and out the door, it was too late. My beloved Harley, the bike I had spent years customizing, was already chained up and rolling away. I ran into the street, yelling for them to stop, but the truck didn't even slow down. It disappeared around the corner. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Margaret. HOA regulations. Unauthorized vehicles have been removed. Office hours at 9 a.m. I clenched my fist so tightly the phone creaked in my hand. She had planned this. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and she was already playing games. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I could have stormed into her house right then and there, but instead, I walked back inside, grabbed my laptop, and started working. By the time I left for the HOA office at 9 a.m., I had a folder full of evidence and a plan. The confrontation Margaret's office looked like the inside of a luxury boutique. Fresh flowers on her desk, a wall of expensive awards, and a cushioned leather chair that she clearly thought was a throne. And sitting right next to her, grinning like he had already won, was Tom Peterson, tossing his tow truck keys in his hand. Like this was a joke. "Mr. Zeit," Margaret said, not even looking up from her computer, "I have your paperwork right here." She slid a folder across her desk like it was a done deal. I picked it up and flipped it through the pages. Inside was a copy of an HOA rule about recreational vehicles that I had never seen before. The section was highlighted in bright yellow. "This is ridiculous," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That bike is worth more than your annual salary. You can't just take it." Margaret finally looked up, adjusting her designer glasses. "Actually, we can." She tapped her manicured nails against her desk. "Article 7, Section 12 clearly states that no recreational vehicles may be stored in driveways." Tom snickered from his chair. "Rules are rules." Margaret nodded, her smug smile never wavering. "We take property values very seriously here, Mr. Zeit." She glanced at my Harley-Davidson hat, then wrinkled her nose. "Some of us can't afford to live in neighborhoods with motorcycles everywhere." She said motorcycles like it was a disease, and in that moment I almost told her. Almost told her that I was about to be announced as the new CEO of Harley-Davidson, that she had just towed the personal motorcycle of a man with millions in legal resources, that she had just made the worst mistake of her life. But something in my gut told me, not yet. I took a slow breath. "Where's my bike?" Tom grinned. "Safe at Peterson's impound lot." He stretched his arms like he was enjoying this. "Standard retrieval fee is $500, cash only." I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the documents. Margaret's smile flickered. "Photography isn't allowed in the office," she snapped. I raised an eyebrow. "Interesting rule," I said. "Is that written down somewhere too?" As I walked out, I heard them whispering behind me. I glanced back through the glass door, watching as Tom slipped something into Margaret's desk drawer. Then I saw it, a security camera in the corner of the office, pointed directly at her desk, a camera that had likely recorded every shady conversation they'd had. I had a feeling those tapes would be very interesting. In my car, I looked closer at the paperwork, and I spotted something strange. The HOA rule they had quoted had a revision date from just last month. Even stranger, the towing company's address matched a property Tom had bought last year, right after becoming Margaret's special advisor for community enforcement. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Margaret. "Impound fees increased by $100 per day. Better hurry." I smiled, thinking about the press conference scheduled for next week, thinking about the news that was about to go public. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting people dig their own holes. I just had to wait and watch Margaret and Tom dig a little deeper. The clock ticked slowly as I sat at my desk, surrounded by papers. The weight of the situation began to sink in. Margaret and Tom had made their move, but now it was time for me to make mine. I spent the next few days carefully organizing everything I had gathered: the fake HOA rule, the financial documents, the unexplained transfers, and the property records. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place, but there was one thing I still needed: public support. I reached out to a few of my neighbors, the ones who I knew had lost vehicles to Tom Peterson's towing operation. Their stories were shocking. The Jacksons had lost their vintage Mustang without warning. The Garcias had their restored Triumph motorcycle towed while they were on vacation. Old Mrs. Chen's grandson's car had been towed during a family dinner. One by one, I gathered their stories, making sure to get written testimonies. They were all angry, but more than that, they were ready to fight back. It wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the whole community. It was about standing up to two people who thought they could control everything by exploiting their neighbors. The rally. It was a Thursday when I received the email from Sarah Wu, a neighbor who worked at the county clerk's office. She had helped me access public records, and now she had something huge for me. "James, I think you should see this. The records from Margaret's bank are all linked to an LLC that her husband runs. They've been laundering money through the HOA fees." My hands shook as I read through her findings. This was bigger than just stolen towing fees. Margaret and Tom were running an entirely separate racket using the HOA to funnel money through offshore accounts and shell companies. I sat back, my mind racing. I couldn't wait for the next scheduled board meeting. That would take too long. I needed to expose them now. I had to act before they could cover their tracks. The emergency meeting, the following morning, I put my plan into action. I emailed the entire HOA board except for Margaret and Tom. The subject line was simple: urgent, financial records for immediate review. I attached everything I had, the documents, the bank statements, and the testimonies. I wanted them to see exactly what was happening in our neighborhood. But I didn't stop there. I also reached out to Jane Wong, a local investigative reporter I knew from a previous story. Jane had helped me in the past, and I knew she'd be perfect for this. I briefed her on the situation, making sure she had everything she needed to cover the story when the time was right. At the same time, I rallied the neighborhood. I scheduled an emergency meeting at the community center. I wanted everyone to know what Margaret and Tom had been doing behind their backs. I couldn't let them think they had gotten away with it. The morning of the rally was electric. I knew that once the neighborhood knew the truth, everything would change. It wasn't just about my Harley-Davidson anymore. It was about all the stolen cars, the fraudulent towing fees, and the lives they had ruined. I stood outside my house, watching as motorcycle clubs from all over the state began arriving. The Veterans Motorcycle Club led the charge, followed by the Ladies of Chrome, the Classic Riders Association, and dozens of other groups. They came in waves: cruisers, sport bikes, vintage models, all gleaming in the morning sun. Each rider wore a bright yellow vest with anti-discrimination rally printed on the back. Margaret's perfectly styled hair and her prized rose garden looked out of place in comparison to the growing parade of motorcycles filling our quiet streets. Margaret rushed outside, her pink bathrobe clinging to her like it was her armor. She dropped her garden hose as she watched the bikes roll in, her face turning red. "What do you think you're doing?" she shouted. I walked over to her, my smile calm and professional. "Beautiful morning for a community gathering, isn't it?" I said, handing her a thick envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter from my legal team, along with photographs of every illegal tow she and Tom had orchestrated in the last year. Margaret's face went pale. "You can't do this," she screamed, trying to shrug it off. "Actually, I can," I said calmly. "We've gathered every bit of evidence we need." I turned to the growing crowd of neighbors who had begun to come outside and join us. "You've stolen from us, lied to us, and used our fees for personal gain," I said, making sure everyone could hear. Just then I noticed Officer Rivera, one of our local cops, standing behind the crowd with a box of paperwork. She stepped forward. "I've got all the proper permits," I said, "and I'm very interested in those kickbacks you've been getting from Tom's Towing." Margaret's sunglasses were no longer a shield. The sweat on her face was visible now. She tried to call for help, but it was already too late. Then the final blow. I pulled out a video from my phone, the security footage from my garage that showed Margaret herself directing the tow truck to my bike at 6 a.m., before the 48-hour notice had expired. Margaret's face turned purple as the video played. She tried to flee back into her house, but she couldn't outrun the truth. "You've been caught." The community center had never been this packed. Every seat was filled, people stood against the walls, and some even gathered outside by the windows just to listen in. The entire neighborhood had come together for one reason: to watch Margaret and Tom fall. Margaret sat at the front, her arms crossed tightly, her fake confidence barely holding together. Next to her, Tom Peterson shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the growing number of angry neighbors. I stood at the front of the room, my laptop hooked up to the big screen projector, flipping through document after document, exposing every shady deal, every illegal tow, and every stolen dollar. "For the past 5 years," I said, my voice steady, "Margaret and Tom have been running a towing scam using HOA funds." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I clicked to the next slide. Bank records. $47,000 in towing fees, $300,000 in fraudulent security fees. Properties purchased below market value after homeowners were forced to pay fines they couldn't afford. Then I pulled up the final video, the one that showed Margaret personally instructing the tow truck driver to remove my Harley before the 48-hour notice had expired. The room fell silent. Margaret's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "This is all lies," she shrieked, but the evidence spoke for itself. Neighbors stood up, one after another, sharing their stories. Mrs. Chen's grandson, whose first car was towed during a family dinner. The Garcias, who lost their motorcycle while they were on vacation. Mr. Johnson, whose classic Mustang was auctioned off illegally. Each story matched a paper trail from my files. Margaret looked around, realizing she had lost. Her safety net, her power over this neighborhood, was gone. That's when Officer Rivera stepped forward. She held up a stack of legal documents. "Margaret Whitmore, Tom Peterson, you are under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and illegal towing practices." The room erupted into gasps and whispers. Tom shot out of his chair, trying to slip away, but two plainclothes officers were already blocking the exits. "You can't do this!" Margaret screamed. "I am the HOA president." Officer Rivera adjusted her belt. "Not anymore." Click. The sound of handcuffs snapping shut was the most satisfying thing I'd heard in a long time. As Margaret and Tom were let out of the building, Margaret turned to me, her face a mixture of rage and desperation. "This isn't over," she hissed. I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough for her to hear. "Oh, Margaret, it's over!" She screamed as the officers shoved her into the back of a squad car, and just like that, she was gone. The aftermath, a neighborhood reborn. The next vote was quick. The neighborhood unanimously removed Margaret and Tom from the HOA. But we didn't stop there. Instead of electing new power-hungry leaders, we did something better. We dissolved the HOA completely. The community decided that we didn't need a power-hungry tyrant running our lives. We replaced it with something much better. A neighborhood council where everyone had a voice. No ridiculous fines, no secret meetings, no abuse of power. Just neighbors helping neighbors. The best part? Peterson's towing was shut down. The missing money was recovered and returned to homeowners. The illegally towed vehicles? They were tracked down, and every owner got their property back, including my Harley. The moment I rolled it back into my driveway, my neighbors cheered. The same community that Margaret had tried to control with fear had come together to take her down. And it felt damn good. 6 months later, a new legacy. 6 months had passed since Margaret's downfall, and the neighborhood had never been better. The garage where she once held secret HOA meetings? We turned it into a motorcycle maintenance workshop for kids. The lot where Tom planned to auction off our vehicles? We turned it into a community park. I even got a letter from a neighborhood across town asking for help. They were dealing with their own HOA nightmare, and they'd heard about what we did, so we helped them fight back too. And guess what? They won. Margaret's fate. Last I heard, Margaret was living in Florida, trying to pull the same corrupt HOA tricks in a retirement community. But it turns out old folks don't put up with that kind of nonsense. One of them, a retired judge, recognized her from the news and reported her immediately. She was arrested again. This time, there was no escape. The lesson: Margaret thought she could bully an entire neighborhood. She thought she could steal from people and get away with it. She thought she could tow my Harley-Davidson, and I'd just roll over. She was wrong. And the truth is, people like her exist everywhere. HOA tyrants, corrupt board members, greedy enforcers. But here's the thing. When enough people stand up, when enough people say no more, when a community fights back together, bullies like Margaret fall. That's the real lesson. And as I sat on my front porch that evening, sipping a well-earned beer, my Harley gleaming in the sunset, I knew one thing for certain: this neighborhood would never be afraid again.